So let's begin. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the United States is a very diverse, multiracial country. We've got people that have come here from all over the world, and every single one of these groups have made their own particular contribution to American society. But when it comes to dealing with the core of racism in this country, we have to boil it down to two groups in particular, and that's African Americans and whites, who were joined together in a complicated history that is long and brutal and even endures today. Now, of course, there's a third group involved in that, and that's Native Americans. And if I were to teach a class on race and ethnicity for the entire semester, I would start with Native Americans first, and then I would segue into other groups. But for the sake of time and the fact that we only have one lecture on this topic, we're going to boil it down to the foundation of American history, and that is African Americans owned as chattel slavery and the whites that built this nation literally on the backs of black labor, enforced slave labor. So, we're going to start with a quote from the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1857. His name was Roger B. Taney, and the title of your slide says, "The Denial of Human Rights by Law." It was referring to a case of a slave named Dred Scott who was trying to sue for his freedom. Now, it's a very long and complicated story about how the slave was suing for his freedom. But the point is, through being a very skilled carpenter and having masters that favored him, he could own money. So when they would lend slaves out to other plantations, those plantation owners would pay the owner of the slave money for his labor. And because Dred Scott had masters too, in particular, that liked him, they would give him part of that payment. So over time, Dred Scott saved enough money to buy his freedom. Not just his, but those of his wife and children. And the owner of him at that time was the wife of his slave owner, because his slave owner had died. And his wife was seeking to sell him because he died in debt. She was going to sell Dred Scott and his wife and children off to separate plantations to make money. And Dred Scott offered to buy his freedom instead, but she refused. So, Dred Scott had a former slave owner who had two sons that grew up with Dred Scott. And they would check on him from time to time at this new plantation. And they found out that this woman was going to sell him and his children and his wife to separate owners. And they got the law involved, where Dred Scott could sue. They sued on his behalf for his freedom. But the Supreme Court heard the case, and they denied his petition. And this is what the Chief Justice said. Negroes, for more than a century before, have been regarded as beings of an inferior order. Now, inferior means less than. And altogether are unfit to associate with the white race. So far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And again, that was Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1857. He gave the opinion of the court. So what does it mean when you say blacks have no rights that the white man is bound to respect? Well, let's look at how that transpired over the years. And I have some pictures here I'd like to show you, because if we were in class, I'd be putting these up on the screen. So, no right to life. Here you see pictures of African Americans being lynched. And this happened throughout the history of this country, starting primarily with the end of Reconstruction all the way through the late 1960s. African Americans were lynched. And here is another picture. You see black men bound to trees. And in this unfortunate picture here, you see a little girl witnessing this violence, because whites would bring their children to these lynchings. No right to live in a safe and clean community, because these are the kind of signs they put up. We want white tenants in our white community. This was actually Warren, Michigan in the 1950s. No right to a decent education. So here, whites would oftentimes block integration, even after the Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Supreme Court. Brown versus Topeka, the School Board of Topeka in 1954 to integrate the schools. There were protests breaking out all over the country, and here you see young white men holding up signs saying, "We won't go to school with Negroes." There's a case in Prince Edward County where they actually shut down the schools for 5 years just to keep black children from integrating. No right to employment. So these are signs that black people would see often. Help wanted, white only. And there are many, many examples of this. Here's something. This was also, this was in Texas. I thought it was in Michigan, but it was actually in Texas. This was a family who thought it would be a funny idea to decorate their lawn with lynched black effigies, effigies of black people's bodies, as a Halloween display. The neighbors didn't think it was too funny, so they made a big stink about it. The press were notified. Reporters descended upon their lawns, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, what's the big deal? Oh, come on, can't they just take a joke?" No rights that the white man is bound to respect. That wasn't just in 1857. That goes on even today. That black people are regarded as completely inferior to whites. So therefore, white people don't have to respect them, even their right to life.